Hello everyone. Of course, there might be some people that say, oh, thank you for finally highlighting these graves, because there is one in particular that I have never seen anyone highlight before, and all of that lot. And I will go into more detail about each and every one of these persons, like I often do. But the other thing I was thinking of when I was started to edit this, I was thinking, do you know what? A lot of people would also want to hear about the history of this cemetery, and I would read this to you. Thought it might be a bit more entertaining, if you get my drift. Here we go. So, in the early decades of the 19th century, London was facing a major crisis. Can't read that word, but I think it means acute burial sites along with high mortality rates resulted in a serious problem. I think we can guess what that serious problem was. Space. There was just not enough room for the dead. Yeah, and that. So, graveyards and burial grounds were crammed in between shops, houses, and taverns, wherever there was space. In really bad situations, undertakers dressed as clergy performed unauthorized and illegal burials. Bodies were wrapped in cheap materials and buried amongst other human remains in graves just a few feet deep. Quicklime was often thrown over the body to help speed up decompose, that's it, yeah, so that within a few months the graves could be used again. The smell of these disease-ridden burial places was terrible. There was overcrowding, undercare, fall and neglect. The cause of this situation was that in the early 1800s, London had a population of over 1 million people. In a few years, the population increased rapidly and the number of deaths along with it. Very little new burial space had been assigned to cater for growing numbers in the 1830s. The authorization was stated that the public health reason something had to be done. Very true. Parliament passed a statute to erect 7 new private cemeteries that should be open in the countryside around the capital for the burial of the London dead. Here's my bit here, guys. Yes, because as you have to remember, you may think, oh my God, is that the Magnificent Seven cemeteries? First things first, yes it is. But you think, but they're not in the countryside. You have to remember, London has vastly expanded in that time. So where you may know all of these cemeteries are now, these actually were the surrounding countryside of London at the time. Right. In 1836, the sum of 3,500 was paid for 17 acres of land that had been on the grounds of the Asher estate, descending the steep hillside of Highgate village. They're not kidding there. Over the next 3 years, the cemetery was landscaped to brilliant effect by Ramsay with exotic form plants, complementing the stunning and unique architecture of both architects. In combination, that was the secure Highgate at the capital's principal cemetery. On the 20th of May 1830, the cemetery was dedicated to St. John by the Right Reverend Charles James Bloomfield, Lord Bishop of London. 15 acres were consecrated for the use of members of the Church of England and 2 acres set aside for descendants or dissidents, people not of COE. The right of burial was granted to either a limited period or in Petuity. The first burial was on the 26th of May 1839, was Elizabeth Jackson, aged 36, of Little Windmill Street, Soho. Opening of the East Cemetery. So the West Cemetery was the first cemetery to open. Highgate attracted a varied clientele and over the next 20 years became one of the capital's most fashionable cemeteries. In 1854, the London Cemetery Company was so profitable that the cemetery was extended by a further 20 acres on the other side of Swan's Lane site. This new ground, not known as the East Cemetery, was opened in 1856. A tunnel beneath the lane connected the new ground with the Church of England chapel in the older west side. How fun. And that. With the aid of hydraulic lifts, coffins would descend into the tunnel and remain on cemetery grounds for their passage to the other half of the cemetery. And that. The first burial in the East was on the 12th of June 1860. Arguably, the most famous interment in Highgate Cemetery is in the East Cemetery and is of the philosopher Karl Marx, who died in 1883. His grave now is amongst the most visited in London. Decline. Yeah, this is where it got interesting a bit. By the turn of the century, the demise of eligible funerals was waning and families began to choose less ostentatious memorials than previous decades. Very true, actually. And at the outbreak of the Great War, many of the cemeteries, 40 or so gardens and groundsmen were all called up to fight. And that. Among some of the wealthiest families continuing to purchase select rites of burials in the 1930s, Highgate Cemetery was passing into a long-term terminal decline with less expensive and more common graves with the main options. Increasing greater number of graves were abandoned as families died out or moved away and maintenance became minimal. In 1956, in an attempt to raise more needed income, the cemetery sold off its stonemason's yard along with the superintendent's house. The 2 chapels were also closed in the same year. The London Company had finally declared bankrupt in 1960 and was absorbed into the larger United Cemetery Company, which for the next 15 years struggled to keep the cemetery afloat. Funds eventually ran out and the gates were closed. God, can you imagine that in today's age with how famous that cemetery is now? In 1975, the Friends of Highgate Cemetery was formed with the aim to promote the conservation of the cemetery, its monuments and buildings, flora and fauna, as in the natural habitat, and that, because I must admit, it is a great situation for the fact that it's a historical landmark, but it's also so ripe with nature for not only birds, bees, wildlife, and of course plants and gnats. So very good when it comes to a suburban city like London. For the benefit of the public, as an environmental situation, work began to clear the overgrown landscape and repair some of the memorials which had been damaged by vandals during the cemetery's decline. English Heritage has listed Highgate Cemetery. Oh, sorry, back up a little, guys. Sorry. Since then, an increased amount of restoration and conservation work is carried out. The Egyptian Avenue and the terrace catacombs, along with 70 other monuments, have now been listed by English Heritage, with over double the number having an expert attending and maintenance. During 2011, the chapel interior was restored to the 1880s colour scheme and reopened for funerals. English Heritage has listed Highgate Cemetery as a Grade 1 listed park, and it is impressed by the continual restoration. Both sides of the cemetery remain open as an active burial ground, with interments taking place almost weekly. And I can definitely testify to that, guys, because effectively, as you've seen the titles of all four men, I might add, that I visited. Yeah, and that. If you think about it, the only one of historical value, because unfortunately I didn't, there was one I was kind of looking for, but I didn't exactly find the exact spot of it, so it really should have been like 5. But as you'll see in the footage, it's not just that, there's a whole sort of area involved in that grave, so you'll know what I'm on about when you actually see it and that. But yeah, all 3 of the main graves, but of course but one of them, he is buried with his family, of course. 3 of them are actually of not only modern graves, but I mean, one of them was buried in 2006, the other one was buried in 2010, and the other one in 2017. So that shows you how even now modern funerals and graves are still taking place and that. So I hope you haven't minded me reading like this. I think, you know, and that I'll see what I do. Either this will be a really long block and then you'll see all the footage, or if I think this is just too much of me reading, you might see me popping in and out. So enjoy, guys.